Kia ora na tātou katoa tōna roto e te aroa mata o te tua. Kia koe matua o tine, e mihi mahana kia koe mō tō karakia e teia popongi. Thank you very much, matua o tine, for your blessing and bringing us into this space. Hello, everyone. Oh, my gosh, there's so many of you. I wasn't expecting quite so many smiley faces this morning, but thank you so much for having me here today. And thank you, Andrew, for the opportunity to be here this morning. And I just want to make a special mention of Callum from MB, who obviously is making some waves here. So thank you so much for doing the good mahi. It's a real pleasure to speak with you this morning here at the New Zealand Green Property Summit. Oh, actually, before I go any further, I do want to make a special mention of my former parliamentary colleague, Denise Lee, who's been wonderful to catch up with you today, and I know you're doing great work in the sector. As the Minister for Building and Construction, it's one of my top priorities to ensure the building and construction sector contributes to the government's climate change goals. We're at the start of a critical debate for climate action, one where decisions we take now will shape the future of our planet for decades to come. New Zealand has committed to a nationwide transition to net zero emissions by 2050. We all have a role to play in that, but the building and construction sector in particular. The built environment is a big part of our national climate change journey. New Zealanders want to be sure that their homes and places of work are part of the answer to the climate change issue, and we owe it to future generations to design and build better and more climate-friendly buildings. The building and construction sector is instrumental in driving that change. Building and construction is a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and from producing materials, constructing buildings, and energy used in buildings. It's important to note that the sector is a small contributor from a production perspective, but a much larger one from a consumption perspective. To give you an example, a production approach to modelling emissions shows that the building and construction sector contributes 3% of New Zealand's overall emissions. This is primarily from the consumption of natural gas, coal and wood-fired heating in residential buildings. However, building and construction drives a meaningful portion of emissions, up to 20% of overall emissions, if taking a trade-weighted consumption view, which includes the production of imported materials, imported building materials, emissions involved in the construction process, and buildings' energy use. The design of a building also influences upstream and downstream emissions. For example, manufacturing products like concrete and steel produces emissions in the heat industry and power sector. The sector's current approach to demolition also produces emissions in the waste sector. It is undeniable that the sector needs to undergo a transformation in terms of how it operates and builds. Today, I want to outline the sector's role in supporting the government's plan to create a carbon-neutral Aotearoa by 2050. The government has committed to an ambitious plan to reduce the carbon footprint of buildings and construction in New Zealand. The Zero Carbon Amendment Act 2019 aims to make our country carbon-neutral by 2050, starting with a carbon-neutral public sector by 2025. It will require government to develop and implement policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the effects of climate change. Under the Emissions Reduction Plan, New Zealand is required to produce emissions budgets over multi-year periods. As part of this work, it's important that we address the role that the building and construction sector plays in New Zealand's overall emissions. The Building for Climate Change program has been established to lead the sector's contribution to the Emissions Reduction Plan and produce a roadmap of how the sector will reduce carbon emissions. The program will require the sector to start taking a broader perspective on building and construction. We have committed to two broad areas of action to support the path to low emissions and a climate-resilient future: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation will involve improving the operational efficiency of buildings, which will reduce energy and water use, and improve ventilation and comfort. It will also reduce the whole-of-life embodied carbon footprint of buildings, including emissions generated from making construction materials, the construction process, construction waste disposal, and disposal of buildings at the end of their useful life. Adaptation will involve improving the ability of buildings to withstand future climate change impacts to ensure New Zealand's resiliency. The Mitigation Program has 4 objectives: to signal the direction of travel to the sector and the public, to require buildings to perform in a new way, to enable people to calculate and measure buildings' impacts, to ensure people can access and afford the methods of products they need for high-performing buildings, and ensure people have the skills and knowledge they need to fulfil their responsibilities. We intend the Mitigation Program to lead to better outcomes such as lower energy use, less carbon-intensive materials, higher performing buildings, and warmer, drier buildings. And one way we will achieve these goals is by setting limits for operational and embodied emissions. 2 frameworks have been developed. Firstly, the Transforming Operational Efficiency Framework. This will look at how to improve the operational efficiency of buildings by looking at factors such as reducing emissions, reducing water use, and improving occupant health and well-being. And secondly, the Whole-of-Life Embodied Carbon Framework. This will look at reducing upstream emissions and encourage a whole-of-life way of looking at emissions reduction. It will address the embodied carbon in buildings throughout their life cycle by looking at factors such as maximising new build efficiency, increasing building material efficiency, and reducing the carbon intensity of the materials used in new buildings. It provides an opportunity to move the focus from a building's upfront costs to more long-term costs and impacts. Considerations include how building materials are produced, operational efficiency, what maintenance will be required, and how materials will be disposed of after a building is demolished. Many of you in the room today will already be starting to think this kind of whole-of-life perspective on building. We need to make this kind of thinking become the norm with your help. This change in perspective will deliver a transformational shift to the emissions and makeup of New Zealand's built environment. This will mean we are not just lowering emissions, we are delivering better performance buildings that are healthier, warmer, drier, and cheaper to heat. The 2050 vision is clear that we are all better off. My vision is that by 2050, New Zealand's buildings are using as little energy and water as practical. They are warmer, drier, and better ventilated and provide a healthier place for us to live and work. That the well-being of New Zealanders has improved, they're leading healthier lives, and respiratory illnesses from cold and damp houses are uncommon. That people have more money in their pockets due to lower energy bills. That our infrastructure finds it easier to respond to demand for water due to our lower use. This means we cope better with water shortages than we have ever done before. That our energy grid is more renewable, partly due to the efficiencies from the sector. And that we all know a sector-wide transition to lower transition to low emissions is a huge task. But our experience with a range of events, including natural disasters and economic disruptions, has powerfully demonstrated our ability to adapt, which should give us comfort that the task we face should be achievable. The end goals of this program are simple: reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve New Zealand's resilience to climate change. These 2 outcomes are the driver of everything we will be doing. Energy efficiency and carbon emissions will become core considerations when building, valued as much as cost, aesthetics, and time. The initial focus of these frameworks has been on new buildings, to shift the way we build and avoid locking in more emissions. However, I know that 2/3 of the buildings that will be around in 2050 have already been built. We need to consider how to reduce emissions and improve the performance of existing buildings. We also need to be conscious of the complexity of this issue and its potential impact on the sector and building owners. That's why officials are starting to explore a range of both regulatory and non-regulatory options for achieving our goals for existing buildings. For the frameworks to deliver the results we need, we must ensure the sector and the public have the information and support they need to make the required changes. That's why the program also has work streams that will be considering workforce transformation and looking at incentives to support the changes. Throughout the development of the Building for Climate Change program, there has been an ongoing focus to reach out to the sector to get their thoughts on the plans. MB ran a public consultation in September and October 2020 to get feedback on 2 program frameworks. We received a total of 374 submissions from a wide variety of individuals and groups in the building and construction sector. Local government, industry bodies, professionals, business owners and homeowners all provided valuable feedback. And to those of you in the room who shared your views with us as part of this process, thank you. Your contribution will help us immensely in making sure that our work keeps going in the right direction. We received a clear mandate from your feedback. 92% of respondents agreed that the sector needs to take action to reduce emissions. We heard strong support from across the sector to the Building for Climate Change program's proposed approach to emissions mitigation frameworks. And using your feedback, we will continue to refine the framework's technical methodology and consider what other actions might be needed to support and enable the changes proposed in the frameworks. We will also use your feedback across the broader Building for Climate Change program to inform how we might manage the built environment's adaptation to the impacts of climate change. Removing barriers to people using greener materials is a key consideration, and materials selected and used within construction can have very different environmental impacts. For example, the production of concrete and steel has a larger carbon footprint than timber, and I'm focusing on making sure that the building regulatory system doesn't get in the way of people using greener materials. Our consenting system is performance-based, which allows people to innovate. The program will not prescribe specific products, and there's a risk that could stifle innovation, but we'll make sure that the system is fit for purpose. Sustainable product use must become the norm, not the exception. The program will take into account a post-COVID world. New Zealand's economy has changed since COVID-19, and I know that the building and construction sector has been hard hit by the impact, and the focus is now on recovery. We will therefore be conscious of how our proposed changes will impact the sector and the ability of people and businesses to cope. I'm committed to making sure that the Building for Climate Change program understands the new sector and how the proposed changes will affect those within the sector as well as wider New Zealand. But we cannot overlook the issue of housing affordability either. The added pressures of the housing crisis have made the operating environment increasingly strained. We believe it's possible to achieve the goals of Building for Climate Change without increasing housing inaffordability. This might mean that there are other trade-offs for people, such as opting for slightly decreased house size or somewhat less unique design. And I genuinely believe that we can build houses that are energy efficient without breaking the bank, and part of our goal is to show how this can be done. New Zealand admittedly lags behind international standards in terms of the quality of our homes and buildings, and it's important that we bring New Zealand up to these standards. The benefit of this, and not just in terms of reducing emissions, they will also be wider societal benefits, such as seeing more Kiwis living and working in warmer, drier and healthier buildings, and reducing the amount of money they have to spend on things like water and power. New Zealand will be facing different challenges to its buildings than those 50 or even 10 years ago, and because of this, it's important that we ensure New Zealand's buildings will last and are able to cope with the different climates that are unavoidable. Under the Zero Carbon Amendment Act 2019, the Government has until August 2022 to prepare a National Climate Change Adaptation Plan. This is a whole-of-government response to how New Zealand should adapt to climate risks. The Building for Climate Change program will be working with other central agency partners to develop the National Adaptation Plan. Building for Climate Change will be leading the homes and building component of this plan, and this will include looking to how we can improve the resilience of our buildings to the changing climate, so that people and communities can thrive. The core of the response will be making sure that the right buildings are built in the right places, and as well as regulatory options, the work will look at non-regulatory options are likely to help drive more resilience in buildings, such as the provision of information and incentives. So what are we asking the sector to do? We need climate action across all levels of the sector. The sector needs to be making decisions that take into account the risks and the opportunities from climate change. I want to acknowledge all of you in the room today. You are already leading the way, and this is a great start. By being here today, you are showing a willingness to change, and I know there is a lot of great work going on. For people already in the industry, they can take action now to increase their knowledge of how much carbon their building is using. Start exploring and understanding the energy efficiency and carbon footprint of the buildings they design and construct. Make use of energy and carbon modelling tools and techniques. Look to international best practice for energy efficient buildings and low embodied carbon buildings. Consider designing out construction waste and start separating and reducing waste and looking for opportunities to reuse or recycle. Existing energy performance tools such as Neighbours NZ, Homestar and Greenstar could be used by those who want to start improving the performance of existing buildings now. They are likely to contribute to the outcomes the frameworks are trying to achieve from New Zealand's building stock. People building a new house or businesses that are procuring a building can consider if there could be emission savings in an existing building that could be upgraded to be more energy efficient. Start asking their design and construction team about the energy efficiency and carbon footprint of their project at the very beginning so that it can be set as a priority, and start asking how waste can be reduced on their project. The message is simple: we need everyone to be part of the solution. A low emission sector will require innovation and ingenuity, and this will be a team effort. The sector will need to be innovative in its approach to climate change, and I'd like to prompt your thinking today about what you could do to help transform the sector and help us to get to zero carbon. New Zealand is now on a path to a low-emission, climate-resilient future. I've set out today how the building and construction sector can play its part in perhaps the greatest call to action in its history, and the government's role in supporting this. We know that realising a lower emission future for the building and construction sector is not an easy task, and it won't be done overnight. It's a challenge that requires bold vision, commitment and perseverance. It requires involvement from the sector, government agencies, key stakeholders, iwi, local government and communities. There's a long way to go, but getting there could not be more important. Our future depends on it. We're already taking the first steps, and now is time for us to use what we have learnt to make real progress in our journey. I want to thank you very much, and I hope you have a very awesome day. Ka pai.